Good morning. Today's daf is daf Ayin Vav. We are at the mission at the top of Ayin Vav Amid Aleph. Let me share my screen and we'll get started. Uh, Given that this is returning to the topic uh, of Trefot after a little bit of a break from that discussion. So it really is all essentially a new topic. So let's just jump right in with the Mishnah. And I'll note that the rear legs of these of larger animals have essentially three bones. Roughly, they correspond to the thigh, calf, and foot in humans. And they have two joints, again, also roughly corresponding to the knee and ankle. The ankle ends up being a little bit higher. It has a sort of longer foot that doesn't all, a human's foot is sort of all along the ground, but these animals, their foot is just a hoof, and it's sort of like extends up a bit to their again effectively ankle. Not using obviously the technical terms that wouldn't actually mean anything to me, but in any event, again, three bones, two joints. So the Mishnah details when problems with these legs causes the animal to be considered a treifa. So let's dive right in. Again, top of Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. Behema shenechtechu raglaha min ha'arkuva ulamata. If in fact an animal's ragla, its legs, and that effectively means its hind legs, are has a severance, has a total, has been cut off, and it was cut off below arkuva is a joint. Now we don't know which joint that this is referring to. That's why Rashi says arkuva mefarish begemara, top line in Rashi. But back into the Mishnah, if it is from that Arkuva and below, so then that is, or really from just below the Arkuva, then it is Kshera. The animal is kosher. Min Arkuva ulamala, from the joint and above, well then psula. And again, it really effectively means a little bit above the joint. Then it is puzzle. V'chein shenital tzomas hagidim. And the same thing is true if the junction of the gidin was removed. Now, the junction of the gidin refers to three sinews that come together, around the lower joint of the animal. And so if that junction is removed, we'll see exactly where that junction is when we get to the Gemara. Then in all of those situations, it's going to be in those two situations, rather, a higher leg being cut off, or the removal of the junction that will result in it being puzzle, which effectively is saying that it's a treifa. Nishbar ha'etzem, if the bone is broken, and Rashi tells us below nechtach, but we're not dealing with it being cut off. It's just not, it's just broken, somewhat internally. We are going to see in the Gemara that we're dealing with a situation where it has broken skin, the breakage. Because if it doesn't break skin, we'll see that that'll be fine and it won't be a problem. But imrov habasar kayam, so if it's got broken and if most of the flesh is there, well then shchita so mitar to. Well then the shchita will make even the limb okay. As Rashi says, we'll read the first part of Shchita Somitarto. This is the second line of the narrow lines of Rashi on Ayin Vav and Aleph. Umutter ba'achila. It's going to be edible, the limb that even though it had this breakage. V'im lav, on the other hand, if there is not a majority of flesh remaining, ein shchita somitarto, then the shchita will not cause it to be permitted. Let's continue on in that Rashi, beginning of the third line of the narrow lines of Rashi on Ayin Vav Amud Aleph. V'im lav, Ein shchitaso mitarto. Again, that's essentially a quote from the Gemara that Rashi is offering. This is Rashi often does that when discussing longer topics, that he'll weave in the words of the Gemara into what he's trying to explain. Va'afilu b'makom she'abehema muteret. And even if this breakage was in a place where if it was severed, it would be okay. Havi aver asur. The limb itself would be prohibited. Mishum ubasar basadet treifa. The quote of the pasuk that says that you need to, the meat in the field that is a treifa, you shall not eat. So keda amrinan, as we saw earlier in Ayin Gimel Amud Bet, lahevi aver va'basar hamidodolin, that in essentially when it comes to a limb and the flesh that is hanging, it's not, it's going to be considered as if it was cut off while it was alive, potentially, and therefore not treated as if it was shechted, even if you do shechita on the rest of the animal. So while the rest of the animal may be kosher, this little piece would not be. Okay, and so now we have the Gemara, and the Gemara is going to clarify what the first cases in our Mishnah are talking about, and in particular, what joint are we referring to? And so Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Chia. So was that in the name of Rabbi Chia? Lamata. What does lamata mean? Lamata min harkuva. It means below the joint. Again, not really particularly helpful, but I'll note the beginning of the Rashi on the second Rashi on the Gemara. Lamata. Lamata min harkuva samach la miyad ka'amar. What it means is immediately below the joint. Lamala, and what does lamala mean? Lamala min harkuva. And as the next Rashi, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 lines up from the bottom of the narrow lines of Rashi on Ayin Vav and Aleph, lamala min harkuva miyad kamar. That immediately above it, is what it's talking about. And treifa, it will be a treifa if the leg is severed at that point. Dahainu bitzomas agidim. That point, which is right above and this is Rashi's referring to the lower joint. We'll see in the Gemara that this is referring to the lower joint. So essentially, what is effectively like the ankle of a human. It's the lower main joint of the leg. So that is in and of itself the location of the junction of the sinews. Shehu samachla, because that junction is very close to the lower joint. V'kol shekain begovo, and certainly anything severed above that point will be problematic. Ulakaman parach, and we will ask shortly, my v'chein shenitot somas hagidim. Why are you also separately telling me in the Mishnah that if you remove the tzomas hagidim, that also will be a problem? Isn't that obvious? Because that's what we're talking about right now when we talk about a severance of the leg right above the lower joint. V'ha-tanale l'mala min harakuva treifa. As we already learned that if it's above it, it's going to be a treifa. So the point is that we effectively already know that. So why does it need to teach us it? So, and then back into the Gemara, as the Gemara asks, last word on the third to last narrow line of the Gemara, Be'ezo arkuva. So Amru, what arkuva joint? What joint is it referring to? Barkuva hanim keret imarosh. It's referring to the arkuva, the joint that is sold with the head. Effectively, that is a reference to all the extremities. That if the core aspect of the body is going to be sold altogether, but the bottom joint and everything that goes and below it and the head, which are sort of less attractive, they all get grouped together and sold together. So we're referring to the lower joint, again, effectively like the ankle in a human, although again, as I noted, it is it is a higher up on the leg of a cow or bull, etc. Ula Amar, Ula. What did Ula say? Rabbi Oshia, Amar Rabbi Oshia, Rabbi Oshia, he said in the name of Rabbi Oshia, Kenegdo b'gamal nikar. No, it's not the lower joint. It's actually a higher joint that you can see in a camel because you cannot see what is effectively the knee in a cow because it's essentially covered by the body of the cow. So again, it's important to note that this lower joint, some similar to our ankle, has the ability to bend uh, forward towards the head. This is how an animal can sort of like crouch down. And the knee that bends backwards, you can see it in a camel because the camel's leg has enough formation and curvature to it, but you can't really see it within a cow. And so as a result, this is now referring to the upper joint, as Rashi tells us. Begamal nikar to kasava Rabbi Oshia arkuva de masnisin. I'm sorry, this is the 6 lines up in the Rashi from the bottom of the narrow lines, and we'll just do part of this Rashi. Begamal nikar, in a camel, it's recognizable to kasava Rabbi Oshia because Rabbi Oshia thinks arkuva de masnisin, that the joint referenced in our Mishnah, he arkuva helyona, it's referring to the upper joint. Visham bolet etzem b'yerach gamal, and in a camel, that joint protrudes from the leg because the entire leg of the camel is visible. Okay, so that shows that there's a debate. So Amrle Ula Rav Yehuda. So Ula says to Rav Yehuda again. Rav Yehuda said that we were referring to the lower joint. So Bishlam Aladidi. To me, the Mishnah makes sense. Da'amino kenegda begamel nikar, that I'm referring to the upper joint that is visible for a camel. Hainu de katane bechein shenitel tzomas hagidim, because that's why we needed to reference the severance, the removal of the of where the joint of the where the sinews come together, of the junction of the sinews. Elodidach, but according to you, who say that we're referring to the lower joint. Why do you need to tell me about removing the junction of the sinews? Isn't that obvious that it would be also problematic? And Rashi explains the question for us. Top of the Y lines in Rashi, near the end of the line. Hainu dekani dekatani v'chein shenito. Mishum detana lamata min harkuva elyona. Kshera, that since we're saying that below the upper joint is kosher, this is of course the Ula's view, dahainu nechtach etzem ha'emsa'i, that I'm referring to the cutting of the middle bone. Again, remember that there are 2 joints, 3 bones, one above the top joint, one between the 2 joints, and one below the bottom joint. And he's now saying that when we say that cutting below the upper joint is going to be kosher, itzrich lamisne v'kein shenitol. I have to also teach about the removal of the junction of the sinews. De'afal gat de'imnekta begova kshera, that even though if you were to cut higher up than that junction, you would be kosher. Hecha de'nechtach b'shipule, where you cut at the bottom of the slant, b'makom tzomas haginim, at the very bottom of it, where it's sort of the corner, namely where you get to that ankle junction, the ankle joint, treifa, it would become a treifa. Kedemitaritz lekaman, as we are going to explain further momentarily. V'al titama shaharei chodcha mikan umesa v'chodcha mikan v'chaya, and we are and don't ask about, hey, isn't it odd that you can cut from this place and it'll die, and that place, which is even less extreme, and it will live? Because we're going to give an answer to that question. But according to you, Amrat Arkuva Tachtona, that when you're referring to the joint, you're referring to the lower one. Lamala Dikatani, once we say that it's above that, the Katani b'masnisin, the one, the joint, when we say that anything that's above that joint is going to be if it's cut off, it's going to be a treifa in our Mishnah, lamala miyad. We're talking about immediately above, besamuch, and very close to that joint, which is mashma hainu nitel tzomas hagidim. That is the location of the tzomas hagidim. So as a result, that it's much more problematic to you, Rav Yehuda, who are quoting Rav and Rabbi Chia. So Amrleh, Rav Yehuda responded to Ula and said, no, here's the story. Rechuva below Tzomas Hagidim, Tzomas Hagidim below Rechuva. No, when I say that that being cut off above the joint is going to result in a treifa, that's where you don't have to do any damage to the location of the junction of the sinews. And when I say that the Tzomas Hagidim is going to be a problem without the bone, it's without that's without the removal of the joint and the bone that's with it. And so as a result, that way everything makes sense. Meaning, when we say in our Mishnah that we're going to cut just above the joint, and it's going to be a treifa, it's going to be a treifa even if you don't affect the junction of the sinews. And when we say we're going to remove the junction of the sinews, that's going to be of treifa even if you don't affect the rest of the bones. So doesn't that explanation work? So Ula says back, no, it does not work. Because v'hanechtaku katani, the Mishnah itself referred to the situation where it's severed. And if it's completely cut off the leg, you can't cut off the leg above the lower joint and not also sever the junction of the sinews because of where the junction of the sinews is located. Ishtik. And so Rabbi Yehuda had nothing to say in response. Levasar denafik Amar, but after Ula left, he said to himself, my taima lo amrile, why didn't I say to him, lamata min harkuva, that actually below means below the arkuva, lamala mitzodas hagidim. And when we say above, we don't mean above the joint, we actually mean not just above the joint, but even above the tzomas hagidim, with the junction of the sinews, as Rashi explains. So my time lo amri dilamata, when we say below the ka'amar that we said in the Mishnah, hulamata min ha'arkuva umitzomas hagidin. It's below the arkuva and the tzomas hagidin. Ulamala de katani, and when we say above, lav lamala miyad, we don't mean immediately above, mashma, ela begovo shel etzem, higher up on the bone, lamala min atzomis, above the junction. V'hadar tana, and then afterwards we learn, v'chein shenital atzomis, that also it applies if the junction is removed. De'im nechtak b'toch atzomis, nami treifa, that if it got severed, if it got cut off, at the junction of the sinews, then it would also be a problem. And so as a result, everybody's trying to set this Mishnah up as below a point, above a point, and in the middle of a point. And so now Rav Yehuda has come up with a way so that his approach works that way. Because again, Ula's approach, which was to effectively say that had it all work out exactly that way, that above meant above the upper joint, below meant below the lower joint, meaning below the upper joint and the middle bone, and then below, and then we had to say, and Tzomasa Hagidin is problematic because that's in the middle. And so now Rav Yehuda has come up with a similar approach that makes it in the middle. So Hadar Amar, but then after he thought about this some more, he said, below Amrile, but didn't I tell him, V'Amrli Nechtaku Katani, and he pointed out a problem with what I said, right? I said that maybe what we're talking about is removal of the leg without the sinews and removal of the sinews without the leg. And he said, but it says that it's severed, it's all cut off. So as a result, that can't be the meaning. Hachanami here, he tell me here also, it can't be that it's referring to above the tzometz hagidim, that it's referring to above the junction of the sinews, because it doesn't say, when it says lamala, it says min harkuva ulamala katani. It says from the joint, not from the tzometz agidin ulamala. If it had said min tzometz agidin ulamala, well, then my explanation would have worked great. So as a result, Ula's questions effectively stand, and Rav Yehuda's explanation doesn't work as well as Ula's explanation of our Mishnah. So Rav Papa Matni Hacha, although we have just reviewed this entire discussion in one particular way, Rav Papa taught it slightly differently. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Rav, Amar Rabbi Chia, that he taught that what did Rav Yehuda say in the name of Rav and the name of Rabbi Chia, but rather not let lamata meant immediately below, but lamata min ha'arkuva umitzomas hagidin. That when we say lamata, we're not actually referring to, and Rashi helps us out here, we're not actually referring to the lower joint, but really we're referring to the upper joint. And now let's take a look and see how does that work. Lamata, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 lines down in the Y lines of Rashi, and it's near the end of the line. Lamata demasnisin, when our Mishnah says below, lav lamata miyat, it doesn't mean immediately below. Ka'amar. Dirakuva demasnisin, because when we talk about the joint of our Mishnah, Birakuva Elyona Myri, it's now talking about the upper joint, the joint that's more like a knee. Hilkach lamata dida, and so when we say below it, Dahainu etzem atzma'i emsa'i, which refers to the middle bone, right? The below the upper joint is the middle bone. Zimnin de treifa, that would sometimes be a treifa. So when we say that it's not going to be a treifa, kagon b'tzomas agidin, for example, if you were to cut it at the tzomas agidin. And so Ella hachikamar. So therefore, what we're really saying when we say below the joint is the following: lemata osa rekuva. It's below that joint, ume etzem emsa'i, and below the middle bone. And so as a result, when we say below the joint, we are referring to a combination of the joint and the middle bone. Kulo, the entire middle bone. Dahainu be'etzem hatachton, which is really referring to the lower bone, the lowest bone, meaning below the lower joint. And vadai kshera, and that situation would certainly be kosher. And so that's the situation that is our Mishnah is talking about, according to Rabbi Chia. And so as a result, and now when we say lamala, and we're now on the first word of the 8th line of the Y lines of the Gemara. Let me just make sure that I got that right. Yeah, 8th line of the Y lines of the Gemara. Lamala min ha'arkuva umitzomas hagidin. And when we say above, we're referring to above not only the middle bone, but the upper joint. And so clearly when you're up on that thigh area of the cow, if there's a breakage there, that's going to be a treifa. And so now we have a whole middle area where we haven't explained anything. Any kind of breakage in the middle bone, we haven't detailed. And you know what? It's also going to be a problem if the severance, if the cutting of off of the leg is at the tzomas hagidim. So the arkuva gufa, and so arkuva gufa kedeula amar Oshia. And so as a result, when we say what joint are we referring to, in this read that Rav Papa is offering, he is agreeing with Ula. And so as a result, everybody's agreeing that we're referring to the upper joint. Umi ika midi, but 1 second. Can there be such a thing? Because now what are we saying? We're saying that if you break the middle bone, not at the location of the joint junction of the sinews, well, then you can have the animal not be a treifa. But if you break the lower bone lower down, then you're going to have it's going to be a treifa. So let's take a look at the Gemara and see the question inside. Umi ika midi tilu midle pasikle v'chaya. That if you cut it in one place, it's going to be a chaya. It's going to be a live animal, meaning not a treifa. Mitate pasikle umesa, and below that you cut it off and it's going to die. That seems very unlikely. You would think that you would always be riskier if you cut more. So Amar Rav Ashi explains, as we saw a few weeks ago, treifos kamidamis lahadadi. You're going to try and compare two different kinds of treifas against one another. Ein omrim b'treifa zo d'lemola zo. We don't compare them. Sharei chotcha mikan umesa. Because sometimes you can cut in one place and everything will be fine, and another place everything will be terrible. So that's the bottom line. And so we have these two approaches, and the second approach, has Ula and Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav and the name of Rav Chia saying the same thing. The Eluhain Tzomas Hagidim. So what is the Tzomas Hagidim that we're talking about? Three different viewpoints as to its precise location.
They cut the animal. If they cut this animal and it becomes, so, as we're saying, at a certain point, it's a treifa. So this animal, but is that during the shechita process or is it not shechita process?
Oh, not during the shechita process.
Therefore, then why, if that's the case, then why would the animal then, or that part of it not be, or that part of the animal not be considered nevela instead of just treifa?
Well, we're not referring to the part that was cut off. You're absolutely right that the part that was cut off would be Aver min hachai and treated as a nevela, 100%. But now we're referring to the rest of the animal. Is the rest of the animal a treifa now that it's slaughtered after this part of the leg has been severed, or is it still kosher? That's the question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we're saying what happens if you remove the junction of the sinews. So where is that junction of the sinews? So we have three different answers, and these are three different sinews that travel along the bone as you go up the leg, and then they begin to fan out. So Rabba Amar Rav Ashi, de Agrarma Ulavar. It's where it goes outward from the bone. Rabba Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Ashi. So that's going to be higher up because, again, it starts going along the bone and then it spreads out. Rabba Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Ashi de Agrama Ulagav. No, it's when it's inward towards the bone, meaning that the part of it is going to be lower, more below where it comes together. So the question is sort of like, are we focused on the point of where they all meet and above, or the point where they all meet and below? And Rabba Breda Rabba Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Ashi. The Mesoras Hashas changes it from Rav Asi to Rav Ashi. De Ilave Arkuma. We're talking about from above the Arkum bone. The Arkum bone is one of the bones effectively in the lower joint of the animal. So Yosef Hahumar Abanan, Kamei de Rabbi Abba, Yosef Kamar. So his rabbi was sitting in front of Rabbi Abba, and he said, the Arkuma Gufa. No, it's not above the Arkuma, but it's the Arkum itself. So Amarle Rabbi Abba, Lo Titzaitsule. Don't listen to this guy. Because as Rashi tells us, 4 lines up from the bottom of the daf, Lo Titzaitsule, the Machmir Tvei, he's being too stringent by saying that it's a lower position. So Hagi Amar Rav Yehuda, Heke de Pare Tabche. Rabbi Yehuda said, look at where the butchers flay the leg and separate the leg from the skin that's above it, and that's where you should be worried about it. V'hainu Rabba Breda Rabba Bar Rav Huna Amar Rav Ashi, and that's the same position that we said in the name of Rabba Breda Rabba Rav Huna. Bar Rav Huna in the name of Rav Ashi, namely again that is the above the Arkum bone. Okay, so now we had these 3 different opinions, and we've seen that at least according to the new viewpoint, Rav Yehuda ends up saying the same as Rava, the son of Rabba Bar Rav Huna.
So
So
does the Gemara want to understand where the damage, the cut, the break in the sinew is? Is that what it wants to
correct.
ask?
That's where is it? Where is this junction of the sinews that if those sinews get removed, we treat the animal as if it is a treifa. So,
On the sinew, because the sinew connects the bone to muscle.
correct, correct. And these sinews are right opposite the lower joint on the animal, and they come together at that point. And at that point, that is going to be where it's problematic.
So the
So,
question is that
if they get removed,
so that I mean, why would it matter if the sinew is 2 centimeters long? Why would it matter where on it? If it's at are we referring to the junction
well,
at the muscle or the junction at the bone or anywhere in the middle of this piece of gid?
well, the question is we just said in our Mishnah that if this junction gets removed, then the animal is a treifa. If it gets cut higher up or lower down, it is not a treifa. So we need to know exactly which part that if it gets removed makes the animal a treifa. And so the bottom line is that it's right, basically just above uh, on the cow. But we're going to get more
I'm
details
not
right
sure
now.
what you mean by above and below. This connects bone to muscle, so it's
Correct, but the
a
sinews.
linear piece. So if it cut an inch from the or centimeter from the muscle, or 6 centimeters from the muscle, or it could connect, or does it refer to the point where the sinew actually connects at
So
the
it's
bone?
somewhere between those two, right? The
Oh,
junction that we're referring to, where it connects to muscle, it's definitely high enough that if it gets severed there, that's not the junction. And where it connects to bone, it's definitely low enough that it's not, that's also not going to be considered the junction. And so if the sinews get removed in either of those spaces, it's not going to cause the animal to be a treifa. It's only somewhere in the middle, and that's
uh-huh.
what we're trying to identify. So, Amr Rav Yehuda, Amr Shmuel, Tzomas Hagidim She'amru, Makom She'Hagidim Tzomsim. It's where the different sinews come together. V'ad kama, how much space does that refer to? Amr Lahu Hahu Merabanan Rav Yaakov Shmei. It was Rav Yaakov who said, Ki Abinan Bei Rav Yehuda Amr Lan. When we were at the yeshiva of Rav Yehuda, he said, Shimu mini milsa de megaber rabba shmieli umanu Shmuel. I heard something from a great man, and who, by the way, is that great man? It's Shmuel. Tzomas hagidim she'amru, when we refer to the junction of the sinews, makom she'hagidim tzomsin. It's where the sinews come together. Makom she'tzomsin ad makom mispashtin, and it's the place where they are joined until the place where they separate. The comma, how wide is this space? How long is this space? Amar Abaye, arba batde b'Torah. It's 4 finger breadths in the of an ox, and there are some. Rashi is the one who tells us. Bottom line in Rashi, arba batde, arba etzbaot. It's 4 finger widths. That's how long this junction is. I will note that the Ramban, I understand, says 16 finger breadths, which seems, from the pictures that I'm seeing, a little bit more likely in terms of the length. But in any event, the question is sort of exactly where this is. So, Bud Kamai, I'm sorry, Bidakamai. When it comes to a smaller animal, what's the story there? So Amar Abaye, Belite Havu Tzomas Hagidim. It's where they protrude. That's the junction of the sinews. Belie Lo Havu Hagidim, where it's more absorbed and you don't see it from outside the animal. Then that's not the junction of the sinews. Ashune havutzomis hagidim. When it's hard, that's where the junction is. Rikiche, where it's softer, lo havutzomis hagidim. It's not the junction. Alime, where it's really strong and thick. havutzamas agidim. Ketine, where it's really smaller, lo havutzamas agidim. That's not the junction. Chivre, where they're white, havutzamas agidim. That's the junction. Lo chivre, where they're not white, lo havutzamas agidim. That's not the junction. As we turn now to ayin vavam bet. Mar Barav Ashi Amar, Mar Barav Ashi says, you know what? Kavan dezige, even where it's clear, as Rashi tells us, dezige Chullin, you can see through it. I love this old French. I think even I can understand that. Clear as. It's clear. Levanim ktsat. Well, that's a little bit white. Marbar of Ashi disagrees that it has to be sort of solidly white. Rather, even if it's just a little bit a clear, kind of pale, that's going to be okay. That's going to be the junction as well. So Kevan Dezigi, even since it is pale, afal gavdelo even though it's not actually white, that's also going to be part of the junction of the sinews. Okay, so Amar Amemar. So now Amemar discusses the sinews themselves and what kind of breakage there needs to be in order to consider it the removal of the sinews. Amar Amemar Mishmei de Rav Zvid Tolasa Chutei. There are three different strands of these sinews in the legs of the ox and cow, etc. Chad alima. One is particularly strong and particularly wide, utre katine, and two are smaller. Ipsik alime, if the larger one gets severed, gets cut off, as the rove binyan, well, then you've lost the majority of the structure because the one large one was bigger than the two small ones combined. And therefore it would be a treifa, according to this initial read. Ipsik tene, if the two smaller ones get cut off, as the rove minion. Well, now you've lost a majority of the number of the sinews in the junction, and so also it would constitute a treifa. Mar Barav Ashi Masne Lakula. But Mar Barav Ashi taught the same thing that a Maimer taught, but he said no, it was lenient. Meaning, ifsik alima, if the thick one gets cut off, ha'ika rove minion, we still have a majority with respect to the number, and therefore it's not a treifa. And ifsik katine, if the two smaller ones get cut off, ha'ika rove minion, we still have a majority of the structure, and so it's not going to be a treifa. And therefore, according to this latter view, all three need to be cut in order to be a problem, and it certainly seems by the Ein Mishpat's location that would be the way we follow. Be'ofot, when it comes to birds, as we take a quick departure for sinews of birds, shitzer chutei havu. There were 16 of these strands. Ipasik chad minayo treifa. And if even one is cut, then it's going to be a treifa. And Amar Mar Barav Ashi, Mar said the following story: Hava ka'amina kamei de Abba. I was standing in front of my father. Ofa, and then somebody brought him a bird. Uvada va'ashkach be chamesar, and he only found 15 strands of the sinews. So he was going to say that it was puzzle because it was a treifa. Havachad to have a shani mechavrit. But there was one that looked a little different than the others. So napse va'ashkach trei. He split it and saw that in fact it was two strands that had come together, and therefore it was really a kosher animal, and none of the strands had been cut. Amar of Yehuda Amarab, back into the topic of the larger animals. Tzomas Hagidim Sha'amru, when we refer to the junction of the sinews, Berubo, when it needs to be a treifa if it's cut majority. So my rubo, what do you mean by majority? Majority of the gidin, a majority of one gid, a majority of all the gid. What do you mean? So rov echad mehen, even the majority of one sinew would make the animal a treifa. Ki hamrita kamei de Shmuel amarli. But when I said this in front of Shmuel, he said mikti tlasahavu. Look, there are three. Ki mipsik chad minayu legamri ha'ikatrei. Even if one is completely cut, you still have two left. So how could that be? How could it be that a majority of one is going to be the problem? So taima de'ikatrei. So it seems like you need to have two left. Halek a tray. If you don't have two left, well, then it would be a problem. Upliga de Rabbanai, and that would disagree with Rabbanai. To Amar Rabbanai, Amar Shmuel, because the Rabbanai understood Shmuel to say the following: Tzomas aginim afilu lo nishtayr ba ella kechud hasar bal. That they understood that Shmuel said that that you need to that as long as there's anything left, that even if there's just one string from a cloak left of the sinews, that's going to be kshera, it's going to be kosher. The Ikeda Amri, some say that actually the version is a little bit stricter than what we just said, because the conclusion of what we just said is that even if one little strand of one of the three sinews is left, it's going to be kosher. And the alternative approach is the following: my rubo. What do we mean by a majority? Rov kol echad ve'echad. If a majority of all three of them are cut, then it would be a problem. Ki amrita kamei de Shmuel amrli. But when I said this in front of Shmuel, what did he say? Michti. Let's take a look. Tlasa havu. There are three. Ha'ika tlasa de kol chad v'chad. But one second, there's still 1/3 of each one left in this case. And so as a result, that shouldn't be a treifa. Messiah leila Rabbanai, and that's a support for Rabbanai. To Amar Rabbanai, Amar Shmuel, Thomas Hagidim she'amru, afilu lo nishdayer ba ela chut hasar ba'al kshera. That as long as a string of sinew remains, it's going to be kosher. And the difference is that now in this approach, there needs to be, even according to the Rabbanai's understanding of Shmuel, that you need to have at least a string of each of the three being left. But if in fact you had a majority of all three being cut, you have two completely cut and a majority of the third one cut, well, then that would be a problem according to Shmuel. And so that ends our discussion of the sinews. My apologies that I don't have the biology as quite as precise as I might have otherwise liked, but in any event, that should give you a general sense of the overall structure here of both the leg and the Gemara. Now we get to the Mishnah considers the broken bone case from our Mishnah. So, nishbar ha'etzem, if the bone is broken, and again, we saw in the Mishnah that it referenced that if in fact you have a majority of the flesh there, well, then then when you do shchita of the animal, the entire animal is kosher, even this limb that has the broken leg, even the broken leg. On the other hand, if in fact there's not enough flesh that's left, well, then, as we understood the Mishnah, the leg itself, the broken part of the leg itself, would be considered a nevela, but the rest of the animal would be considered kosher if you did the shchita, because it's not a treifa. So Amar Rav gave the following clarification, which is again not quite consistent. Well, not consistent with the words of our Mishnah, but consistent with the ideas according to Rav. Rav explains the following: Lamala min ha'arkuva, when you're talking above the lower bone, meaning that you're talking about any kind of thing on the middle bone where it would potentially. 1 second, let me make sure I get this right. Yeah, in the middle bone, where it would be potentially a treifa. Imrov habasar kayam. If majority of the flesh is still there, zeb mutar. Well, then not only is it not a treifa because the majority of the flesh, you can eat the leg and you can eat the entire animal. V'im lav. If, however, not all of the flesh is left, and zeb, Rashi tells us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 from the top of the narrow lines of Rashi, 16 lines down. Zeb Aver ubehema mutar. When we say the zeb mutar, we mean the limb is permitted to be eaten and the animal itself is permitted to be eaten. V'im lav, but if not, zeb asur, then they're both prohibited. And Rashi tells us, well, 1 second, didn't we say in our Mishnah that just the limb is prohibited? So Rashi explains how we can understand this statement of Rav with the Mishnah. Because umas nisin tekatani imlav. This is the next Mishnah, the next Rashi, excuse me, in the Rashi. V'imlav zebezem asur umas nisin tekatani imlav ein shchita so mitarto. When our Mishnah said that if you don't have enough meat on it, then it's considered as if the shchita will not purify the limb that has been cut off or that has a broken bone in it. The mashma Aver Usser, which implies that only the limb is prohibited, Ubehema Muteris, and the rest of the animal is permitted, Alamatam in Arkuva, Kamar. That's talking about below the Arkuva, below where it is, below the lower joint. And so as a result, when the breakage is in the foot area, the lowest joint of the lowest bone of the leg, then if it even that is where if the flesh is there, even the leg itself will be kosher. Even that limb, that lower part of the leg will be kosher. And if the flesh is not there, well, then that part of the limb won't be kosher, but the rest of the animal will be kosher. Imrov lamata min arkuva, below the joint. Imrov back into the Gemara, and we are.
When Rashi mentions shchitato mitarato, that's
the language of our Mishnah. That's the language of our Mishnah, correct. And it's referring to the limb itself.
Right. So when I'm a little confused, I want to clarify this, because in earlier Gemara, when it talks about the shchita is mitaher, it means it removes it from the category of nevela. Is that still consistent here?
Yes, it is. But here, it's not only making it tahor and not a nevela, it's actually making it a kosher to eat.
Because in the other case, in the Gemara,
you're right, 100%. That's why you have to look at context. Context really matters here. So in the other case, when we were dealing with, for example, the limb of the animal that
protruded from the vaginal canal,
from the birth, you're absolutely exactly. That's exactly right. It was tahor because it was now going to be treated like a shechted treifa, according to the rabbis, and not like a Aver Minachai. So you're absolutely right. It really makes a difference what we're talking about. And here it is talking about being kosher to eat, and not just that it's not tameh of tumas nevela.
That's what I wanted to clarify.
No, 100%. So now, fourth to last of the narrow lines in the Gemara, second word on the line, lamata min harakuva. If the breakage is below the lower joint, Imrova basar kayam, if most of the flesh remains, zev then everything is going to be kosher. Imlav, if not, meaning if most of the flesh is not there, aver asur, the limb itself is prohibited, uvehem muteris, and the rest of the animal is permitted. And of course, that would be the case that our Mishnah was talking about. And so that's why this lines up exactly with our Mishnah. Our Mishnah would therefore be talking about a breakage below the lower joint. So Ushmuel Amar, Shmuel disagrees. Bein lamala, bein lamata. No, it doesn't make a difference whether the breakage is above the joint or below the joint. Meaning it could even be on the middle bone. So imrova basar kayam, if most of the flesh remains, zev mutter. Well, then both of them are permitted because it's not considered nevela and it's not considered a cut off. Imla, but if not, aver asur, the limb itself is prohibited, uvehema muteris, and the rest of the animal is permitted and therefore is kosher to eat. So Maskif lo Rav Nachman asks, 1 second, L'Shmuel, Yomru Aver Mimenu Mutal, Bashpa Umuteris, you're going to tell me that this limb is going to be put in the trash and the rest of the animal is going to be permitted to eat? That can't be. That seems very inconsistent. You shouldn't be able to do that. Well, Amrle Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. 1 second, Rav Huna responds, but Rav Nami, even according to Rav, right? I mean, you're trying to use this as Rav Nachman, you're trying to use this as a proof to Rav. But even Rav would agree that if the breakage was below the lower joint, you would have, and you didn't have enough flesh there, you would throw away and you'd be able to eat the rest of the animal. Yomru aver mimenu mutal ba'ashba umuteris. You'd say the same thing. Throw away the lower joint, the where it's cut off and where there's not where it's broken and the flesh is not sufficient to cover the breakage, and then you can eat the rest. So that your question, Rav Nachman, also applies to Rav. So Amar Le, Haki Kamina. No. Let me clarify what I meant. Because that's not, you didn't understand my question clearly. What I meant was the following. Aver shechayami menu mutal ba'ashba umuteret. You're telling me that an aver, a limb, at a point where if it were cut off, it would be a treifa. And so as a result, the life is dependent on it. Meaning, unlike Rav, who says that when we're talking about if it doesn't have enough flesh, you cut it off and you can't eat it, but the rest of the animal is kosher. That's at a point where if that part of the leg had been completely severed, the animal would not be a treifa and the rest of the animal would be kosher. And so you can imagine how there can be many cases where the entire leg is in the trash, the entire leg cut off below the lower joint is in the trash, and the rest of the animal is eaten. But what you're saying, Shmuel, is that even when the part that you're going to end up cutting off and throwing away is at a height in which the animal would be a treifa if it were cut off, and now you're going to throw that in the trash, and you're going to distinguish between that trashy leg where if you can eat the rest of the animal and a severed leg at that same point, and that where you can't eat the rest of the animal because the animal would be a treifa. That's my inconsistency. That's my concern. And so so that's the question. So how do we answer that question? So shalchu mitam, they sent. So
what is the question again? Is it cut at the same point or is it cut at different points?
Okay, it's the same point. Here's the question. All right. According to Shmuel, if you have a breakage in the middle bone of the leg, but there's not enough meat around it, well, then everything from that breakage point and down needs to be thrown away, and the rest of the animal is still kosher. And what Rav Nachman is saying is that if that had not just been a leg breakage, but had been a severance of the entire leg, meaning if it wasn't just the bone that broke, but the leg was entirely chopped off at that point, then this animal would have been treated as a treifa and would be totally not kosher. The rest of the whole body of the animal. So here we have two identical legs that end up in the trash. One, it's be there because there was a bone that was broken and there wasn't enough flesh around it. And one because it was severed. And the rest of the animal in one case is going to be kosher, and in the other case is going to be a treifa. And so that's the question that Rav Nachman's asked. Now, of course, there's a difference between the two cases, because in one case, the leg wasn't totally broken. It wasn't severed. So one can answer it from a halakhic perspective, but from an appearance perspective, and therefore maybe the rabbis should be stricter as a result. That's the question that Rav Nachman is effectively asking. How can we allow that? And now
but the animal, in both cases, the animal is removed from the leg. That part of the leg is removed from the body, right?
Correct. That part of the leg is removed from the body, and that part of the leg is definitely not kosher.
So when do we find the leg in the trash can, and then we try to decipher what happened, or do we know beforehand?
I don't think he's intending to be literal. Meaning he's saying, how can it be that you say that the end result in one case is this part of the leg and down is prohibited, and the rest of the animal is permitted. And in another case, same point on the leg, this point of the leg and down is prohibited, and the animal is prohibited.
But they
How
have to know
come?
the circumstances.
Yes,
If you find the leg in the trash can, you don't know what happened.
that's exactly right. And so that's what he's saying is like, if you don't know what happened, it does seem odd that you could end up with these two different kashrut statuses of the remainder of the animal in these two cases. So that's the question. And we don't answer that question, but rather they tell us what the halacha is. So shalchu mitam halchasa kavasei de Rab. They sent a ruling from Eretz Yisrael that the halacha is like Rab. Hadar shalchu kavasei de Shmuel. Then they sent a ruling that the ruling's like Shmuel. Hadar shalchu kavasei de Rab. And then they sent it again and it said it's like Rab. And not only that, the Aver Atzmo Metame Bamasa. Not only is it like Rav, but that the limb itself is going to convey tuma is if it was a nevela, even though it was not part, even though it was still attached to the animal while it was alive and while the shechita happened to it. So Masav Rav Chisda said that doesn't seem right. Lo, that's not true. Now he's quoting a brisa. Where Rabbi Meir is talking to the rabbis. Lo im tiaraso shchitas treifa osa. That look, I can understand where the shchita could make the animal that's a treifa purify itself. Ve'es ha'ever ha'meduldalba. But and similarly, a limb that is attached to it can be not a treifa. Davar shegufa, because that is all part of the body of the animal that you're shechting. Tatar as a ubar, but you're going to tell me that it should also purify the limb of the fetus? Davar she'ena gufa, something that's not attached. And so we see here that Rebbe Meir and the rabbis all agree that if it's attached to the body of the animal, it's not, even if it's dangling, it's not going to make it into a it's not going to make it into a nevela. And so here, how could Rav have said that the halacha is that it even transmits tuma based on the nevela? It was shechted, and so as a result, that can't be. So Amrle Rabba Haduri.
Why is he bringing the nevela to this? Because
we said it says the Aver Atzmo Mitame B'masa. That the halacha ruling that we got from Israel, the third of the halakhic rulings that was sent, said not only is the halakha like Rav, but the limb that had the broken bone in it and now is being cut off and not kosher, it's going to be considered tamei if you carry it. And so that's the halakhic ruling that we're challenging, because this brisa makes clear that everybody agrees that when you have a shechita on an animal, even if it's got some part of its body hanging out and not really fully attached, it's going, that hanging part might not be kosher, but it isn't going to be treated as a nevela. So Amrle Rabba says, Haduri apirka lamalach osiv masnisin. Why are you asking from this brisa? Ask from a Mishnah. Because what does the Mishnah say? This is a Mishnah on Kaf Zayin. Amud Aleph, Nishchata Behema, if an animal is slaughtered, Hukshru B'Nameha, it is prepared to become Tameh as a result of its blood. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Lo Hukshru. It's not prepared. Now, this case in that Mishnah is not just talking about the animal itself, it's also talking about where there is a limb and flesh that are dangling off of it. And so as a result, in that instance, we can see that the limb and flesh are not automatically tamei. They become heksher l'kabel tuma, but they are not automatically tamei. And so that shows that, again, the halakhic ruling that we heard from Israel, that the carrying of this severed limb now is going to convey tuma, is not correct. So Amrle, Rav Chisda explains to Rabbah, no, masnisan ikaludchuya, you could push that off. Kidadachinan, as we have pushed off, as we saw a couple of days ago, that in that situation, what were we talking about? Take a look at the Rashi. It's Rashi 3. From the bottom of the narrow lines of Rashi, it's about 24 lines up. As we saw, pushed off earlier in our perek on Daf Ayin Gimel Amibet, my Huksharu, what does it mean that it was capable of becoming Tameh? Abbas or Kamer. It's where only flesh is dangling. Because when you only have flesh, that can't be Aver Minachai. Because Aver Minachai, Di'inami shchita osanipol. Because even if you say that we treat shchita as if the hanging piece is cut off, aim tumas nevela bebasar haporish minachai. When it's only flesh that gets cut off from a live animal, that does not have the status of tuma of a nevela. Digidin va'atzamos be'inan, because you need to have sinews and bone present in order to for the whole limb to become tameh with a tuma of a nevela when you're talking when it was porish min hachai, when it was separated from a live animal. As we learned back a few days ago. So
where's that? What's the source of that halacha?
Which the
that we're
halacha
saying that has to be the whole limb and not just parts of it.
Yeah, Aver Minachai, again, Aver Minachai, of course, if you eat the flesh, it's also not kosher. It's still not kosher. It's still Aver Minachai. But
Right.
for Aver Minachai to have the status of a Nevela Tuma, you need to have not just the Aver, not just flesh, but it has to be a full Aver, meaning bone, sinew, and flesh, all
Right.
three together. So
Right, but
that's
where's
and
the
that
source of that?
the source of that is Daf Ayin Gimel Amabet. We a couple of days ago we saw that inside. So Kisalik Rabbi Zera. So now back into the Gemara when Rabbi Zera went to Eretz Yisrael. Ashkechel Rabbi Yirmiyah of the Yosef Amar Lahashmaita. He saw Rabbi Yirmiyah sitting and saying this teaching. Amarle, Yishar, good job. V'chein Tirgama Aryoch Bavel. That Aryoch in Bavel also said that. Aryuch Manu. Who is Aryuch? Shmuel. That was Shmuel. Once again, V'hamiflad Palik. But we've been saying this last 10 minutes that Shmuel was arguing with Rav. In fact, we said that they sent from Israel that first the halacha was like Rav, then the halacha was like Shmuel, then the halacha was like Rav again. No, Hadar Be Shmuel Lagabig the Rav. Shmuel did retract his original position, and he converted to following Rav, and so that is the conclusion. So maybe we will. I didn't get quite as far as I wanted to today, but we'll do this last little bit, God willing, tomorrow. Took a little bit longer to get through. This is difficult stuff. It's a little complicated as a structure, so my apologies for not getting quite as far as I wanted to, but we will pick up with a Gemara that teaches a brisa that clarifies our Mishnah about broken bones and clarifies the fact that we're talking about where the bone broke out of the body, but God willing, we'll have to do that. Looking forward to it tomorrow.
I wanted to actually, I was asking a deeper source. Well, I remember that Gemara, Ayin Beit Amid Beit, where it says Abraham. But my question is that from a pasuk in Chumash? How do we define Aver Minachai?
It's based on the words Aver Minachai, meaning Aver needs a definition. And so Aver Minachai obviously literally means a limb. So right. The point is that we learn from in that Gemara there that what does a limb mean? It does not mean just flesh. Just flesh is not a limb. If you just chop off some, meaty piece of the leg of an animal and don't get any flesh that's associated with it, it's still going to be prohibited. It's going to be prohibited in the general category of eating something from a live animal, but it's not going to be the full-fledged Aver Minachai that would also have the categorization of being subject to Nevela Tuma.
So it's more a tradition or svara than actual pasuk in Chumash, for instance.
Correct, absolutely. I don't remember that it was anything more than that. That's how my recollection of what of the point. All right, looking forward to continuing our learning together tomorrow.